one, is it? Is it on? Is it on? Can you hear me? Yeah, I see a thumb up. Good. Okay, so I'm following up on the other talks in this session, focusing on how dialogue, how speech is used to not just convey knowledge, but to build and construct knowledge together. And this is a project I've worked on with Simon Buckingham Shum, who's sitting up there, and also with colleagues Yulan, who's now at the Eastern University, and Zhongyu, who's joined us from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Wow, you get really small slides on this one. Right, so we're looking at discourse. Why are we looking at discourse? Well, from a socio-cultural perspective, we're seeing language and dialogue as crucial tools in the development of knowledge. So they give us ways of sharing ideas, of talking about ideas, of exploring ideas, of combining ideas. And the approach we've taken is based on the work that Neil Mercer has been carrying out with his team for sort of 15, 20 years now. And they began with work in schools, in face-to-face conversation, and now some of that work has gone online, looking at how this goes on online. They identified 3 main ways of talking to each other in educational situations which were of interest. So there's disputational dialogue. And disputational dialogue is really something we don't want to see going on in our classrooms and our seminar rooms, because it's when people take up a position and they go, I think A, I think B, yes, no. No meeting of minds there. Cumulative dialogue, much more positive. People are putting ideas into the pot and they keep putting ideas into the pot. They don't argue with each other and they come away having learned something, and that's positive, and you'd be quite happy to see that in a classroom or seminar room. But exploratory dialogue is perhaps the most educationally valuable, because that involves not only sharing ideas, but challenging them, exploring them, and combining them. So we're interested in how can you find exploratory dialogue automatically, and perhaps how can you encourage the use of exploratory dialogue. So back in 2011, Simon and I sent a paper to LAK looking at how we could do this in online text chat. And we'd got the chat from a 2-day online conference which took place in Illuminate, or Blackboard Collaborate as it now is. And we'd done this largely manually, going through, trying to find cue phrases and words which would signify that there was exploratory dialogue taking place there. And when we'd found those, we could run a simple find and replace to sort of highlight where this might be going on. So we were looking for these key characteristics of exploratory dialogue, which you see on the left here, things like justification and explanation. And you can see how the cue phrases on the right can signal that those are probably happening in conversation. So if I give you just a very small snippet of that online conversation, this is a minute of conversation. The words which are highlighted in red have been picked out by the find and replace algorithm, and this was picked out as a part of the conversation where exploratory dialogue was going on, where people were exploring ideas, building knowledge together. So that was valuable as far as it went. We could distinguish different parts of the conference from each other. We could distinguish different people's inputs from each other. But it was very labour intensive, because every time we found a word or cue phrase, we had to go through and think carefully about if it worked. So you couldn't really scale it up. So we had a problem. So this is where we began to talk to people from a different area. So we went and talked to Yulan and Zhongyu, who are computational linguists, and we said, this is how far we've got, but you've got the expertise to look at language in different ways. Where can we go with it now? How can you help us to move on with this? So they looked at the work we'd been doing and they said, well, you've got 3 main problems from our perspective. One problem is you've got a very small annotated database. You've got 2 days of conference. That's not really enough to be going on with. You need some way of getting a classifier to train itself to expand that. They said another thing is that usually when we're working to classify text, we're working around topic-based things. So if we're looking for sport, we're looking for words like football and hockey and played well, that sort of thing. But you're not looking for that sort of thing. You're looking for something that could take place in almost any circumstance. So it's not really topic-based. But the third problem is, yes, it is a bit topic-based. Because if you're in an online conference, you could be having some fascinating exploratory dialogue about, is Blackboard Collaborate the best tool to be using? But that's not really very useful when you come back to it in a month's time. Or you could be having some great exploratory dialogue about the people you're working with. Are these good people to work with? Let's talk to them about their experience. Again, good in the context, but not really something we want to follow up on. We want something topic-based. So we want some features that will go across topics and some features that are topic-based. So Yulan and Zhongyu said, well, what you really need is a self-training framework. And there's a couple of approaches you can take to a self-training framework. One of them is you can do self-training from instances. So you can give the classifier some examples of exploratory dialogue or of non-exploratory dialogue and say, hey, go and find some stuff like that. And that works well to some extent, but it starts to go wrong. So this is a sort of dumbed-down version for humans here. The top one there, you go, yes, that's exploratory dialogue, and it's got that key phrase, I think. And that works really well in the next one down. Yeah, that's exploratory. And that one's exploratory. Hang on, it goes wrong here in the bottom one. I think's being used in a different way. So if the classifier was just doing it like that, it would add that one to the data set, and the problems would start to multiply. So they said, we don't think this is a very good way of doing it. We think you need to use features. So for features, you still take the annotated data set, but in this time, you look at it in more detail. You break it down into unigrams, which are words or emoticons or single units. You break it into bigrams, which are combinations. You see on the right, they sort of overlap within the sentence. And trigrams, threes. And then you look at that, you average them across examples, and you can come up with something much more detailed. So in this case, it would look at that example, it would say, no, that's not exploratory. So that's good, that's more reliable, we're happier with that. But it's not really taking into account the topic. So we need more. We can't just do it like that. So they said, right, you need to look at the nearest neighbours of what's going on. Of every turn in the dialogue, look at its nearest neighbours. Now, I thought that was the nearest neighbours in time. I thought that was the one before and the one after. But it's not in computational linguistics terms. It's the ones which have got the most unigrams and bigrams and trigrams, the same as that turn. So they said, we'll look at each one. We'll look at the label assigned by the computer. That's the pseudo-label. We'll look at the confidence label. And we'll take that into account for the nearest neighbours, k nearest neighbours. And in this case, k means 3 nearest neighbours. So if we plug that into an equation, we can use that to calculate a support value for a label given by the computer. So if the computer says it's non-exploratory, let's go and see what the support is for that. Let's calculate it using those pseudo-labels, those nearest neighbours, those confidence values. So if you're like me and you see an equation up on the screen, it goes in one eye and out the other eye. So let's just take that a little bit further. If you've got a label over here, you're trying to find its support value. Now in this case, if its support value is bigger than R, and I've made R a nice easy number, 0.5, if the support value is higher than that, then we say yes, that value is correct, that label is correct. So you take its k nearest neighbours, 3 nearest neighbours in this case, and you say, well, on the surface, this looks good, because it was labelled non-exploratory, and 2 of its nearest neighbours are non-exploratory. This is good, but let's look in a bit more detail. Well, the first nearest neighbour has the same label, so we can take its confidence level over. Its second nearest neighbour has a different label, so we'll just take a 0 over. And the third one again, the same, take them over, top them up, and we get 0.999. Lovely round numbers I'm using for this demonstration. That's not what the computer does. And then we'll divide it by how many labels we looked at. We looked at K labels, we looked at 3. The support value is 0.333. That's smaller than this, so we don't accept that as an accurate label. And then we thought, well, we'll go one level further. So we've looked at the labelled features, we've looked at the K nearest neighbours, but also going back to that pilot work where we did the manual coding, we had these useful Q phrases. We had 94 Q phrases, and they were very precise when we looked at them. So if they said it was exploratory dialogue, then it was exploratory dialogue. They weren't very good at recall. They'd miss a lot, but they were precise. So we added those into the mix as well to add precision. So we got a method. We needed a bit more data. We needed to try this out. So we'd already got the Illuminate text chat from the 2-day conference, and that was annotated. We went to look for some more along those lines. We went to some open MOOCs, and we picked up the chat data from those. So we got another 10,500 turns in the dialogue. They were roughly the same length. The first group were about 10 words long. This group were about 9 words long. So we had a much better corpus, much bigger. And then we found 2 postdoctoral researchers, and we said, can you take some of this unannotated corpus and can you code it for us? And this is a rather cut-down version of the framework we gave them. We said, first of all, can you go through and can you label anything which is obviously exploratory or which is obviously not exploratory? And when you've looked at the exploratory, could you do it in these 4 subcategories? Because we think it would split down into these. We think there's challenge, evaluation, extension, and reasoning. So they went away, did that, came back with the results. We found these subcategories weren't useful because to some extent they overlap. And for another reason, as with most content analysis, it depends how far you've got in the conversation, how you interpret things. So something that doesn't look exploratory at the beginning, you go on a bit further and you say, hey, that was the beginning of a process of reasoning. So those weren't useful, but the coders did agree on if things were non-exploratory or exploratory. They agreed with that enough for us to go on. But we said, let's be even more exact about this. We will just take the examples where you agreed, where you said it was definitely exploratory or definitely non-exploratory. So then we could apply our method to it. So we worked through the whole method. We applied the initial classifier. Then we applied the trained classifier to the unannotated data. And we were doing this with small sections of the data set and swapping them around, doing it with some bits of annotated data and some bits of unannotated data until we'd worked through all the combinations. We were taking in the self-learned features. We were using the Q phrase matching, that's the manually coded ones. And we were looking at K nearest neighbours. And then we repeated that for 5 iterations or until we found only 0.5% of the labels were changing. Now, the full results of that are included in the paper because we tried it with various different methods and we report all those results. That's too many figures, I think, for a slide. So I'm just going to show you 2 here. We've got the pilot, which was the one we reported in 2011, and we've got our preferred method over here. I've highlighted in green where they did the best. So on accuracy, how many decisions were correct? Our proposed method was very accurate. On precision, how many exploratory turns were actually exploratory? Well, the pilot did better than that, but we were expecting that because that was the manually coded data, and we were using that as a sort of gold standard. Recall, our new method did much better on classifying all the exploratory turns as exploratory, and F1, the weighted average, again, it did better. So we were confident this was a better way of doing things. We also experimented with different values for K. How many nearest neighbours should we look at? We tried with 1, 3, 5, and 7, and 3 came out as the best. That gave us the most reliable answers. So in terms of computational linguistics, that's good. We'd solved the problem that we'd set out to. In terms of learning analytics, what does that mean? Well, we think there's a couple of things that we can now do with this. One of the things is we can take a big data set, 2 or 3 or 4 hours of conference, people usually don't have the time to review all that. They want to know, well, where are the interesting things? And we think this helps us to pick out the times when people are really building knowledge together. It also would act as a reflection tool for people who've been involved, for the presenters or for the people who've been in the audience, to think about, well, what was happening there and why was that particularly exploratory or non-exploratory? So in this example here, we've got 2.5 hours of conference data, and every block represents 10 turns in the conversation. So they're not even periods of time, they're even periods of contributions. If it's red, it's generally exploratory. It's 10 turns in the conversation, mostly exploratory. If it's blue, mostly non-exploratory. And the bigger the line, the higher the confidence. Now, you see at the end there, 20 turns in the dialogue take place in a couple of minutes. Lots of dialogue, not exploratory. That's when people are saying to each other, goodbye, thanks, that was great. At the beginning also, a lot of talk, but it's people saying hello, good to see you. Then we've got a fairly bumpy bit at the beginning where there's different speakers. You can see them beginning and ending. Then a fairly long session which stimulates a lot of conversation. So that's one approach. The other approach is to look at the individuals who are involved in contributing. On this diagram, the diamonds represent individuals. We've put in a line here. That's a fairly steep line. We've said, show us the people who more than 5 out of 6 of their contributions appear to be exploratory dialogue. And you see the person ringed in green. They're doing really well on that, very, very highly exploratory. So you can use that to pick out individual performance and give targeted feedback to people. But of course that begins to raise issues. Because if you're the person ringed in green, that's great. If you're the person ringed in red, you might be feeling a bit down about that. Now you might take that as really good feedback and yes, I need to make different contributions. But equally, you might be saying, hang on, my microphone didn't work. All my contributions were saying, hey, help. So that's why it wasn't exploratory. Or you might be saying, but I was the nominated person to welcome everybody. And I was saying, hello, I was doing my job perfectly. Why are you getting at me? So there are nuances within this. You can't just go with it as it is. So one of the things is, how do we use it to motivate people and to guide people rather than to present it as criticism? How do we develop visual literacy that people can look at this and make sense of it? Because with all these diagrams, I mean, as with many of the diagrams at the conference, it takes some getting into to interpret them. How do we develop that? And we're very interested in the idea of participatory design. Should it just be the researchers who make the decisions about this? Or should we involve the learners and the teachers and say, well, what do you want to see and what would be helpful? So just before I end, I want to put in a bit of reflection about working in the middle space, because I'm coming to this from discourse analysis and from education. Simon's coming in from sense making and argumentation, and we've got others coming in from computational linguistics. And we found this really tough to do, because it's not just tough deciding how to frame the questions and to decide what to do. It's tough to interpret what you've done, because you're all working with different vocabularies. And even how we talked about our boundary objects, the things that we had a shared interest in, was difficult. And finding out how to present that to an audience of people, some of whom have got very strong computational linguistics backgrounds, and some people who've got very strong educational backgrounds, is a challenge. So we found it a difficult thing to do, but we found it really worthwhile doing. And we think we've come up with some useful things. We've developed and tested a self-training framework, and that's done better than other methods. We've developed an annotated corpus. We've come up with ideas for future research. And we've come up with ways that this could be applied really to support learners and educators. So the four of us have worked together on this. If you ask me questions, I'm going to be a bit flaky on the computational linguistics. So talk to Zhongyu Wei, give him an email if you're puzzled by this. If you want to come at this from a different angle, if you want to hear a more computational linguistic approach to it, Zhongyu gave a really good Solar Storm webinar to the solar doctoral students. Well worth going to have a look at if you're interested in taking this further. Thanks.
Hi, Gregory Dyke, University of Lyon. So I used to be at last year at CMU, where Caroline Roset's group's done a lot of research on this, and it's kind of difficult to compare, seeing as use very different methods and very different baselines to know how well you're doing and what kinds of features should we try to use if we want to replicate some of that work. I'm thinking particularly of the K neighbors. And I was just wondering, so in the paper you have the kappa for the agreement on coding for exploratory versus non-exploratory, which seems kind of low. And I was wondering what kind of kappa that got for the precision recall figures that you give. What kind of kappa does that translate into?
The only kappas I know are the ones reported in the paper. So Zhongyu and Yulan said that they were happy to go with the kappa for the agreement on exploratory and non-exploratory, but they would like it to be better, which is why we only used the ones which matched. So we didn't take all their examples.
I meant if you take a
two
computer
coders had said this is exploratory, or whether two coders had said this is non-exploratory.
I meant if you take the computer as a third rater, what kind of kappa does the computer get?
I don't think we...
Because it's just with such a low kappa for the human raters, it seems to be kind of similar to essay grading, where computers are doing as well as humans because humans are not really very good at it yet.
Yes. I think that is to some extent true. I think coding for exploratory dialogue is a very tough thing to do, and it's something that Neil Mercer's team, have spent a long time working on how best to do it. So I think, yes, there is room for improvement in the classifier, and there is also room for improvement in the human coders. You're right with that.
Hi, Rebecca. I'm also going to ask a kind of nasty machine learning question. It's really not too nasty. Have you thought of using other attributes than just the dialogue to try and do classification? And so what I mean by this is, take for instance of the person. You might use the language very differently than I might use language, especially in broad open courses where we're not from the same region. And there might be things about the way Rebecca talks that make it seem more exploratory, not just the engrams of the specific language, but the more general way you phrase your statements and so forth, versus the tone of my messages might be very different and mean different things. Have you considered adding those kinds of attributes as well?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility for the future. When Neil Mercer and his team have worked with exploratory dialogue, I mean, as I said, they've been doing this for 15, 20 years. They've done it across several countries. For example, they did a lot of work in Mexico. And what they found was when they worked with people on exploratory dialogue, on developing their use of exploratory dialogue, grades did demonstrably and significantly go up. So although it is to some extent cultural, I think also it is about learning a way of communication around knowledge, and I think this classifier can help with that. But I think you're definitely right. It's culturally specific. Of course, it's only working in English at the moment. One of the things that we're pleased with about it, though, is quite often when you're doing processing of language, you have to take quite formal language, which is correctly spelt and correctly punctuated. Now, we're working here with things which have got emoticons, they've got non-standard spelling, they've got non-standard use of language, and yet it's still coming up with results that are significant. So we were pleased about that. But I take your point, there are more things that could be taken into account. Neil would say to you is that cumulative talk is valuable in and of itself. You don't have to see it as progressing towards, an ideal. So cumulative talk is fine, and that happens in the classroom a lot. I can sometimes see values to disputational dialogue. Other people who've worked with this can't. I would say there's times when you need a bit of disputational dialogue. Other people have strongly disagreed with me on this. Usually, I think Neil's team have found that you need specific support to help to develop exploratory dialogue, and just a few guidelines can help to move not only learners on, but also teachers on, because teachers find it quite difficult to do sometimes as well.
Do you guys have any plans to look at those other types of talk and kind of be able to automate?
Not at the moment. I think we've got quite enough on our hands with exploratory, really.